Welcome back to Government 148. Last segment we ended it discussing the showdown between Rashid Ali Gailani and Prime Minister of Iraq at the time, Nouri al-Said, the Prime Minister that is. If you recall, these two were very different men. Both were from upper classes. Nouri al-Said, the Prime Minister, was very conservative. Both men were very smart, but Rashid Ali Gailani was very much a liberal enlightenment, very similar to Mossadegh of Iran. So that's where we left our discussion, so I'd like to resume it at this time. So we have this tough conservative Nouri al-Said confronting the liberal Rashid Ali. Now, Gailani served as a prime minister for the first time back in 1933, but he actually held office for less than 8 months. On March 31st, 1940, Gailani again was reappointed as prime minister, and by this time, as you can guess, World War II has started. Iraq also had just experienced a year before the premature death of King Ghazi. If you recall, he died in a car crash, but good bit of Iraqi's population believed that he was actually killed or murdered by the British. At the same time, recall that it's the regency that was running the Iraq, because King Faisal II was a very young infant. He was about 4.5 years old. And Abdul Ilah, the maternal uncle, and Nouri al-Said were running Iraq, and they both supported Britain in the war. But as World War II begins, the Germans actually are very successful. They overran France. And with the defeat of France, you may recall that Syria, we discussed this during Syria lecture, which at that time was under the French mandate. Now Syria falls under the puppet government of Vichy, which the German had installed in France. So the pro-change faction in Iraq, who truly hated the British, they decide to play the German card. And the regency was unable to control Gailani. So Gailani becomes the leader of the pro-change group after being reappointed as prime minister, and they actually are in charge now. So Gailani decides that he needs to move Iraq away from Britain, and he uses the war to further his nationalist goal of independence for Iraq by refusing to allow the British troops to cross through Iraq to go to the front. Also, Gailani rejected calls that the British put this call to break ties with fascist Italy, and in the meantime he sends his justice minister to meet with the German ambassador in Turkey to win German support for his government. With these actions taken by Gailani, Britain responds by imposing very severe economic sanctions against Iraq. And meanwhile, the news of British victories against the Italian forces in North Africa dulled the support that Gailani had enjoyed initially for his government. Therefore, with the British advances, what happens is that in January 31st of a year later, 1941, under pressure from the Regency, Abu Ila and Nouri al-Said, Gaylani ends up resigning. So Gaylani resigns, is forced to resign. However, on April 1st of that year, the military actually joins forces with Gaylani, and together they pull off a coup d'etat against the Regency, and this time Gaylani returns to power, and he's now again prime minister. As one of his acts as a prime minister, Gaylani sends Iraqi artillery forces to take on the British forces who were coming into Iraq. By mid-May 1941, British forces end up defeating smaller Iraqi forces, and they enter Iraq, and in the process, Gaylani's forces are defeated by the British, and Gaylani actually ends up fleeing to Persia, to Iran. This time, though, Nouri al-Said rode in a boat up the Tigris River, and he had absolutely no reservation letting everyone know that he was the #1 British agent. So now, with Gaylani's defeat and return of Nouri al-Said, we now get a very tough right-wing dictatorship ruling over Iraq. And that rule actually ends up lasting quite a bit, for about 18 years, until 1958. So from 1941 to 1958, we have this very tough conservative government ruling over Iraq. The cliche that emerges during this period is that Iraq represents the bulwark or bastion of the West in the Middle East. In other words, the belief is that the most stable and pro-Western country in the Middle East happens to be Iraq. Now, you may recall from previous lectures, especially the one related to Lebanon, that 1958 was a very, very important year in the history of the Middle East. 1958, for example, if you recall, was a period during which there was a brief war, civil war, I should say, in Lebanon. During that period, Iraq was supposed to send troops to Lebanon to support the conservative forces in Lebanon. That meant, of course, Shamoun forces. But instead of boarding the planes and heading for Beirut, the troops end up actually marching back into Baghdad, and in the process, they execute a coup in 1958. The general who overthrew Nouri al-Said's government was named Qasim, and Qasim becomes the new ruler. We had no idea who he was. He was not in any of our files, either in the State Department or in the CIA. Meanwhile, Nouri al-Said was boarding a plane to go to Spa in Turkey when the coup took place. Later, they discovered him in woman's dress. Unfortunately, he had forgotten to change his shoes. He had men's shoes on. So they discovered him, and they literally tore him to pieces as British #1 agent. And so was Abdul Ilah also torn to pieces, and the King Faisal II was also executed. So, with General Qasim in charge of Iraq after the coup, overnight, the bulwark of the West becomes designated by the CIA as the nest of communist and Nasser conspirators. So we have Alan Dulles of CIA referring to Iraq as the most dangerous place in the world. Now, it is important to remember that Nasser actually never was invited to Iraq. So if this was a pro-Nasser coup, you would have expected Nasser to be jubilant and be invited in Iraq. The truth was that General Qasem, was not about to give up power to Nasser and to Arab nationalism. Qasem himself was part Kurd, and most probably he was not an Arab nationalist. If anything, he was much more likely to have been an Iraqi nationalist as opposed to Arab nationalist. However, Qasem had a vice president, his name was Arif. Arif was an Arab nationalist and he was pro-Nasser. Now, going back to the year 1958, recall again that this was the moment of very high tension between the superpowers in the Middle East. In July 1958, the same month that Iraqi coup took place, we, the Americans, sent troops to Lebanon, and also the British sent troops to Jordan, both of us fearing that our moderate, responsible client regimes were on the verge of collapse. Also remember that in Lebanon, we went there to save President Chamoun, but ended up, after a couple of months, putting people that were opposed to him in power. In the meanwhile, Turkey had moved troops to the border of Syria to be ready for our expected confrontation with communism and Nasser. In other words, what the Turkish troop maneuvers on the Syria border was an attempt to intimidate the Syrians and the Egyptians, letting them know that we are ready for any confrontation. So you should ask yourself, what was the Soviet response to all of these provocations? The answer simply is that they did nothing to support their Middle East clients, even though, if you recall, under the Eisenhower doctrine, we were maneuvering against communism or their agents, and Nasser was lumped together with communists, and the Soviet really did not do anything to help their allies. You will see that this figure, importantly, when we start discussing Saddam Hussein's foreign policy. Going back to Iraq, Qasem, however, had a brother who was a communist, and therefore we saw Iraq moving closer to communism. Suddenly, though, we also get a Ba'ath Party which allies with Arif, Qasem's vice president. Meanwhile, Qasem began to move increasingly toward the communist, and the communist-Nasser alliance is now beginning to split. Vice President Arif was allying himself with Nasser and the Arab nationalists, whereas the communists really did not look to Nasser for leadership. And of course, Nasser is Nasser of Egypt we're talking about. So we in the United States are now beginning to see what's happening and to learn something about the Middle East. Before this, we really had not much idea of what was happening there. So our recognition that communists and Nasserites are very different political groups marks the beginning of our realization of the political scenery there. In March of 1959, the Ba'ath Party was planning a coup, and lo and behold, the CIA was supporting them. So functionally, we became a de facto ally of Nasser because the party we were supporting, the Ba'ath Party, was pro-Nasser. What happened was that the Soviet read into our communication, and they let Qasem know what was happening. Having been alerted, the plotters were discovered by Qasim, and the coup actually ended up being defeated. The 1959 coup was very, very interesting, or I should say even fascinating, if you look at the alliance pattern there. You have Qasim versus his vice president Arif and the Ba'ath Party. Now notice the people who are supporting Qasim. You have the Soviet Union directly supporting Qasim, but you also have Israel supporting Qasim, and you also have Britain supporting Qasim, versus the United States. The dotted line means not a direct support, more or less indirect support. Question is, why did Israel and Britain preferred Qasim to Arif? Well, it's a general rule for the Jews in the Middle East and for Israelis that they fear Arab nationalism much more than communism. The lethal threat to them is Arab unity. United Kingdom, or Britain, was also so opposed to Arab nationalists that they would have preferred a communist takeover of Iraq than seeing genuine Arab independence succeed. So there is an important Cold War lesson here, and that is, compared to the British, the United States was much more sincere in our anti-communist policy than the British were. Qasim ends up surviving the coup and at least this round of power struggle. In the aftermath of the failed coup, he arrests some 450 officers who became implicated in the coup d'etat. So as you can imagine, the army is now in bad shape. Furthermore, Qasim, in order to secure his hold on power, he creates a civil militia because he really didn't trust the army any longer. And these militia was mostly made up of communists. So a point is reached that it appears that there is nothing standing in the way of communist takeover of Iraq. But instead, we get a communist party that ends up itself splitting in three ways. The three factions of the Communist Party of Iraq: there is a pro-Soviet faction, there is a pro-Beijing faction, and there is a third faction that is independent. Qasim was mostly attracted to the latter, to the independent faction. Now, ask yourself, why didn't the Soviet Union move to support the pro-Moscow faction of the Communist Party? Because it's a fact that they did not. Their official party line explanation was that it would have been premature. It's a dialectical explanation that says you have to go through the various stages. The stage before communism would be bourgeoisie. Iraq was a feudal society, so they have to go first through the bourgeoisie stage before they're ready for communist. So Iraq has to go through that. That was the kind of an official explanation to explain their lack of interest in doing something about supporting the communists. In reality, though, it probably was to avoid confrontation with Nasser and the force of Arab nationalism. Had the Soviet been very supportive, overtly supportive, and directly involved in helping the communists, Arab nationalism would have had nowhere to go but to America, and they really did not want this to happen. Now recall that I mentioned that the Communist Party of Iraq became split in three ways. One of the factions was pro-Beijing, and there is an incident in the Kirkuk area. Kirkuk is the northern part, the Kurdish populated, and also oil rich. The uprising in Kirkuk was actually instigated by the pro-Beijing faction. So when that is discovered, Qasim decides to suppress that faction. So this situation continues for a few years until February 8, 1963. This time we get another coup, and as I said, this time the Ba'ath succeeds overthrowing Qasim, and Arif now becomes the president. What is interesting is that the CIA actually also was involved in this and had some role, although it may have not been as big a role as it had in other coups. The CIA role can best be captured by this quote from the Ali Saleh Saidi, who was the Ba'ath Party interior minister after the coup. He said, "We came to power on the CIA train." Now guess who else was riding on that CIA train? It was an up-and-coming political thug who served as the Ba'ath Party assassin named Saddam Hussein. This is all documented in the book by Tim Weiner called The Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA. So back in 1963, one of the people that we helped to put in power was none other than Saddam Hussein. During the next 5 years, between 1963 and 1968, there is back and forth internal power struggles among the factions within the Ba'ath Party. In 1968, the Takriti faction wins. Tikrit is a village in Iraq, and it is the home of Saddam Hussein. It is really a clan affairs, and you see the traditional and the modern coming together simultaneously. Hussein, far and away, is the smartest of them all, and therefore it's the Saddam Hussein clan that wins.